All right, everybody. This is kind of going to be a little bit of a wild episode. So, this day and during this time of the year, the field is very amplified with the idea of rebirth and what that actually means. As you know, if you guys have been in the content swirl for a while, last year I did a D5 Christ consciousness call, and there has been a lot of information coming in for me, so I felt inclined and kind of inspired to be able to get all of this kind of out and published. So it might not be the most, let's say, edited or coherent podcast today. I might bounce around, but just kind of follow the frequency if you can, and the bouncing ball while I connect a lot of these dots with the idea that I'm going to talk about. And then at the end of the podcast, I'd like to wrap up anything I didn't talk about that I said I would in previous episodes. So this episode is going to be about mirror mechanics, twins, mirrors, and the architecture of awakening, why enlightened figures like a Yeshua or Jesus and Thomas the Apostle, for example, and Enlil and Enki, the Anunnaki, are paired, why these beings in folklore and mythology and religious texts always seem to be represented in pairs. This is coming off of the fact that I've been spending a lot of time on the island that I'm on now with a twin, that if you've been following my stories and my content for the last couple of years around these beings that have been in my field for a long time that are also twins, that I have twins in my family, that, I can just kind of go on and on about twinning and how things are represented in duality and how we learn in duality. So we're going to be talking about that because this came from a question that I had. It was a preemptive question. So 2 years ago, I'm just going to jump right in. So let's just settle into the field together. 2 years ago, when I was in Albania, I had this I woke up and I wondered if the being that we knew as Yeshua was Anunnaki, which may sound a little crazy. For those of you who don't know Anunnaki lore, it is a very ancient, old pre-Sumerian tablets about beings that were very high in dimensional order, that were brothers and twins. One was on the side of evolution, one was on the side of control. And the control side of the Anunnaki is where we got a lot of the telomere capping and the consciousness constraints and kind of this fall in evolutionary trajectory, whilst the other brother was kind of on the positive side, right? So you're looking at a negative and a positive charge. Positive side of maintaining evolutionary integrity. So this was a while ago, and I just kind of kept that question, let's say, buffering in the background before I could get a lot of other dots connected. And this is also coming off of the last couple of days, specifically yesterday, when I was in very, very hot water. The question came in, did Jesus have a twin? I don't know why. Do not ask me that. Do not ask me why these questions come in, but they did. And I have been asking about mirror mechanics, how we seem to have an interface and have feedback in order to have a lot of our own stuff brought up, our own shadow stuff pulled up and out of us in order to reconcile. So somehow it came in through story, somehow it's coming in through things and mythology and religious texts that it would catalyze enough curiosity within me to follow it through. So I'm going to go almost exactly how I noted it And it may be a little bit of an extensive podcast, but we'll see how long this goes. I will have a complimentary essay to this as well. So what I received was, did Jesus have a twin? And we're going to unpack mirror mechanics. And again, as I said before, the question, that answer came in through a QP lens. Twin does not mean biological duplication. It means field bifurcation, split field, right? So one coherent source differentiating into complementary functions so complexity can stabilize without collapse. And so how I interpret that is we can't always see our own stuff, right? That's why many of you come into the field with me. That's why many of you are finding this work now. We need that interface. Otherwise, form becomes unnecessary. Consciousness needs to have form and interaction and mirror mechanics in order to know itself. Consciousness is we are learning how and remembering ourselves and removing all of these patterns that aren't us so we can return to a prime state of our own reality. And so we need this interaction and this interface. So kind of one coherent source that splits into complementary functions. Now, this is also, mind you, coming off of a question I've had for several years about the mechanics of divine union. In my last podcast, I talked about divine union coming online in a major way, this return to your prime frequency being mirrored back to you in union, in partnership. So once again, the twin, also coming off of another podcast I did about twin flames, dispelling the myth, okay, of what that actually means and what that looks like and how it's gotten distorted over time. I do not actually believe that it is the completion of your soul and that it's like one soul in two bodies per se. I think it's one complete source that represents the divine complement, which I'll get into in a little bit more. So, did Jesus have a twin? Yes, but not a biological one. Again, I'm just telling you how this information came in. Twin or paired brothers appeared in ancient Mesopotamian, often later labeled Anunnaki mythology, but not as literal genetic twins in the modern sense. They function as cosmic complements. So with the Anunnaki, or with Jesus, that twin was considered Thomas the Apostle. Now, ask me if I've ever looked up that gospel. Never. Okay, I don't even know. You couldn't even reference this if you, literally it's just pulling through me. So, with Jesus, it was Thomas the Apostle. And I'll tell you why that becomes incredibly ironic. With Anunnaki, it was Enlil and Enki. These two, again, represented a positive charge and a negative charge. Positive, the evolutionary trajectory to keep optimizing expression, and then again, the inversion of that and the control. This is also becoming increasingly important because, again, in my podcast before, I talked about two realities being experienced and created and architected right now, a synthetic one locking in and then organic architecture locking in, meaning our nervous systems are splitting. We're not moving into two earths. We're moving into a mirroring of nervous systems. And this also goes for those who are creating. You are not going to be able to create and sustain inside of a synthetic reality of algorithms that are pumping you full of dopamine-fueled content, right? We're going to have to decide what feels good for us and then follow through with that as we move into this organic architecture. So again, more of this twinning, split reality, mirror mechanics, all coming together, me trying to connect the dots all at the same time. So going a little deeper with Enlil and Enki. Okay, so they are often described, again, as brothers or half-brothers. They're both the sons, according to ancient text, of Anu. They're not twins, but function as dual polarity. So some say that they were twins. Again, how you translate that is up to you. But in the language I understand is, from an ontological perspective, how things, reality is organized and attributed by conditions. I look at it as dual polarity. So did any of these beings actually ever exist? Or were they all created for myth and folklore and story, simply to try to help us define what reality is and how reality actually is experienced, right? Through this dual mirror mechanical nature. So Enlil was the authority, command, hierarchy. It was like atmosphere and storms and enforcement. And we saw this all play out through Greek mythology as well, right? The lord of the gods of the sun, the gods of the sea, etc. Enki was intelligence, creativity, meditation, water, fertility, technology, magic. They appear together repeatedly as opposing yet interdependent forces. So just as kind of a vulnerable side note, if you go back and listen to the motherhood podcast I talked about how at the time, because I was still running a lot of fear patterns and patterns around dark feminine, I was like, I'm not going to be a mother. That was never in my field. And I had reassigned a set of twins. The twin energy that I tuned into now, as they are represented to me now, especially within this last year, is they are very opposite in energy, but entirely complementary to one another. It was just absolute. It's like an inherent knowing. The younger one, softer, more intuitive, sensitive, had tremendous linguistic prowess, even like facial structures, all of it. And then the first is incredibly organized, order, law, right, command, adaptation, dynamics. They are very complementary as brothers, but they represent both. We need to have the balance of all of this. So I say all of that because modern narratives will say that they're Anunnaki twins, but they represent, it's a symbolic architecture of balance maintained by paired intelligence. So not necessarily identical beings, but balance maintained by paired intelligence. So remember that as I move into the next layer of all of this, which was this whole Jesus and Thomas situation. So then I heard another parallel of Jesus and Thomas the Apostle. So Thomas the Apostle received a tremendous amount of information. Now, again, I don't know a lot of what the text says. I just know what was shared with me. So Jesus in this way, or you look at the being that was Yeshua, was the carrier of like the original signal. Thomas is the receiver capable of mirroring that level of coherence back to Yeshua. So a complementary frequency. So it's not the sameness in role, but it's a recognition. And so you get this pinging back and forth of duality. So in early gospel, what was, again, shown to me, told to me, and then I had tried to do my best to reconfigure and distill all of this, is the key figure of Thomas the Apostle. In Syriac Christianity, his name appears as Judas Thomas Didymos. I think that's right, something like this. And both Thomas in Aramaic and Didymos in Greek literally means twin. This is where the idea originates. So Gospel of Thomas attributes Jesus' secret teachings to Thomas. So whether or not, again, that is accurate, to me, it just strongly implies intimate mirroring, okay? And that when you are operating within a certain level of resonance and coherence, you are going to attract people to you that are going to amplify what you need to pull up and out of you, clarify your own teachings. Same thing that's happened and continues to happen with me, and why I help you all clarify what's going through and going on with you. So because this is such symbolically dense language, I just had to look up to get any kind of backup, either if I was crazy or what was actually going on here. So the gospel, likely around the 1st and 2nd century, attributes Jesus's secret teachings to Thomas. So that was actually like a check for being accurate. And it never explicitly says that Jesus had a biological twin. It just implies that he had a lot of people around him that he was, let's say, bouncing ideas off of. That's the best way I could describe it. So it's always it's resonance, not genetics. So it led me to ask the question, did any of these beings truly exist? Or are they simply mythology and folklore and story and text that are trying to help us understand how reality really works through narrative and meaning making, which is how our nervous systems understand the assignment here. So I'm just going to put a pin in that because that's kind of a TBD. Now back to more twinning and more examples of all of this. So another example of where these twin consciousness, or let's say one field of intelligence, one coherent signal gets mirrored back to itself, is through Castor and Pollux, mortality and continuity. Castor being a time-bound form, Pollux is continuity beyond form. Another example of this is Horus and Set in Egyptian mythology. One is coherence, the other one is fragmentation. So you see it represented one, the divine mirror, right? One coherent signal that gets mirrored back to you in divinity, and then you get another coherent signal that gets refracted or fragmented in polarity that is helping you mirror towards, helping you pull up and out of you the things that need to get reconciled, people, places, things, family members, etc., through pattern recursion. This would be the twin flame dynamic, right? It's the opposite. You'll get the inversion, right? Then you get the betrayal. Jesus and Judas, Horus and Set, right? The Buddha and Mara. You get the opposite reflected back to you until you don't need that level of memory to remember anymore. So why does this split? So from a field level perspective, why do we need duality, right? Why do we have to have a split field in order to remember? So the field function here is coherence that cannot withstand disruption is not coherence. It's actually avoidance. So we need the inertia, we need the rub in order to have that level of voltage, if you will, for us to become aware of the pattern that we're running. So if you look at kind of the comparative snapshot between all of these things, all of these different examples, with Jesus and Thomas, you kind of have this signal and then you have the recognition of that. So truth must be perceived in order to exist. And then with Castor and Pollux, you've got time and continuity. Identity must survive form. This is another lesson, right? Through these stories. Then you've got Horus and Set in Egypt. You kind of have order and disruption. So stability must be tested. To me, all of these things are representing simply the way an ontological system works. Imagine punching holes in theology to the point where all of it collapses under its own weight. So again, I come back to the question, were any of these things actually real, or are we And am I just tapping into a field that simply has enough belief inertia behind it that I can interpret what the myth proposed or said or didn't say or whatever? Especially being in so many grid lines and walking around and being in the world and thinking about what people actually believe. I'm like, but wait, yeah, a lot of people are like, all we know are these texts of stories. What if the story just doesn't exist and it's all just kind of entertainment? So once again, more of a, just put a pin right in that, this very existential, esoteric question. Through twinning, through mirroring, which kind of, if I just ruthlessly reduced everything down to the question of what are the mechanics of mirroring, I understand why we need it. I understand why we're living in polarity and why we need this duality and part of how this reality is formed within. And I talk a lot about that in the Field Hub. I answer you guys' questions. And then we work specifically and will work exclusively on pattern recursion in the pattern lab, meaning all of the reasons how, why, what, behaviorally you are the way that you are, and how to transmute those things to return back to your prime reality, right? Moving more towards your original frequency signature. So you don't have to repeat so much memory. Essentially, if everything is memory and we're a soul moving through it, how can we really perceive what is true and what isn't true? And again, that's another pen. So I'm going to move into mirror logic now and see if we can make some sense of all of this as we work this out in real time together. Okay, so then I asked what the question, like, what's the definition of mirror mechanics? Meaning, if I just simplified this into practical application, you're in your family environment, you've done a lot of work, you're sitting at the table and literally so bored because no one can really understand what you're saying because you have a completely different reference point now, especially if you've cleared up a lot. Or you can absolutely track, sense, see, and know the limitation of the people that you're commiserating with perspectives. You can actually start to see their pattern architecture. And you can clean up within yourself to a certain degree. But where most of you are now is you haven't quite figured out how to enjoy yourself and all of that. And this is the edge of evolution. You're at that razor sharp edge of learning how to move beyond these different edge points, these limit sets, so you can actually start expressing in a different way and bringing new things to you and have more of a nourishing environment. For me, I would say, I haven't talked about joy recursion yet, but I will. I'm going to talk about joy recursion a lot in the pattern lab this coming year. So check out the website for that. But for me, joy is a nourishing experience to be in. And you're not in a memory-bound experience where you're trying to hold your field together so much that you end up being drained by that level of responsibility. Because if you don't hold your field together, you might get reactive, and then that's not fun to be in triggering environments, right? You're being mirrored back to you. Everything is a feedback loop. I talk about this a lot. So if you don't take any of the myth stuff that I said before this, and you just drop in somatically to the body now, you know that you're in a feedback loop, right? That you are interacting with people and certain experiences feel good and certain people feel good. Certain things feel of resonance, certain things don't. Certain things trigger you, certain things no longer trigger you. You have a visceral right? You have a visceral reference point for that. The challenge is, why do we need so much mirroring? And we need the density to pull the patterns up. But are we going to be able to move beyond that to where it doesn't feel so heavy? And the answer I got was absolutely yes. And part of what's locking into the field now, as a complementary backup to the podcast I made about organic and synthetic reality architecture that we're moving into, is that you will start to feel lighter by the time that seal lock kind of completes. And we're in that closing period now. And January, February, and March, you're going to start to feel a literal unravel. So it'll be like compression, expansion, compression, expansion. And then finally, it will be a much needed exhale. So I know part of you guys are in that now. Like even I've had really tight, the best way I can describe it is compression. It feels like I get put into a zip file and then I get unzipped, zip file, unzipped, and they contract really tight. And then I'm really uncomfortable for a night or two. And then I feel much lighter. So a lot of data is being released out of the collective, just as a side note. And all fields are recalibrating. And right now, we are losing a lot of people. Family members are dying, they're passing, they're dropping the body because there is a field incompatibility with the resonance that we're all moving into, the bandwidth that's available for us now. It is literally, they cannot interface with this level of density, and they're not choosing to. They'll just re-render in the new lighter density and move through their memory again. So I'll do another podcast episode because a lot of stuff came in about death and contracts and do we even have contracts and things like that. Ultimately, it's all answering a lot of bigger questions that I had. So the definition through a quantum psychosomatic lens is mirror mechanics is essentially field bifurcation. It is a twinning type of experience, and that occurs when one coherent source signal splits into two complementary expressions to stabilize complexity across reality layers. So if a soul is choosing to have a twin experience, there is double the possibility to be able to move through a lot of memory together, right? There is an amplification of one coherent signal splitting into two complementary expressions or two opposing expressions to stabilize pattern lesson and complexity across multiple reality layers. So it's one source field with two differentiated functions maintained with maintained resonance via contrast. So the evolution occurs through tension, not sameness. Doesn't make any sense to have two twins just being the same. Same. But like, what are we really doing here? We're not learning anything. That is not optimal evolutionary code. We need the challenge to be able to optimize. So it's a signal differentiation to preserve coherence across familial domains. So you guys have heard me talk about this, how your frequency signature is like an IP address, and then that IP address connects to form, and that's your domain. And then that domain is hosted by a server. And what you're doing is you're constantly updating the server. So you would move, like for me, it would be, I did Tally 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.0, 3.0, 5.0, all these different versions. And then all of it collapsed, and now it's like Talíyah 1.0, right? And then it's like 1.1 and then 1.2, much like you see with machine learning software right now, the ChatGPTs, the Kimmys, the Groks, and whatever else is going to come out into the universe. They all update, similar with iOSs, right? With Apple updates, you'll get a 0.2, a 0.3. Your consciousness stations at different bandwidths, which means that your nervous system is able to take in more information because your body is the interface. So if you have one source, if you have one coherent signal that bifurcates into two functions, that's how you get this deep connection with a twin, because essentially you have incredibly complementary nervous system codes. You have split nervous systems and you're quantumly entangled constantly. So you can feel your twin. You're very different completely. You could be completely polar in opposition in terms of what you like. One twin can be, plugged into the matrix. The other one can be like freeing herself or himself and flying into a different reality. Or you could have siblings where you have no idea how you're even siblings. Again, but you're twinned. Or you feel like you've met a twin, but not a biological one. These are things to pay attention to. This is Mirror Mechanics 101. So when I say you're working across layers, it will be an ontological layer, which is that one source, two functions. Like I have one field, two offers, right? Infinite possibilities for now. You move across neural, somatic, energetic, behavioral, relational. So you're learning how to move across these layers with the optimal mirror as your soul signal, your original signal. This is what I've learned so far about mirror mechanics. Without going in it too much deeper, what can I say? What else came in? Let me just see. Let me scan myself. Oh, okay. So if I was going to use kind of comparative insight, the twin versus the mirror logic with again, a Jesus and Thomas, the type would be a twin mirror recognition of each other's signal. And then let's say you had Buddha and Devadatta. There was Devadatta, Mara, and Ananda, I think. That would be a shadow mirror, so ego distortion. And then you've got Buddha and Ananda as a reflection. This was memory mirror, that temporal continuity. So I keep coming back to the myth as reality instruction. And then you had Buddha and Mara as archetypal mirror, kind of nervous systems. And then you had Horus and Set, once again, as shadow and archetypal. So it's mirrors of truth. Like, let's say Jesus uses a twin to mirror truth. Buddha uses mirrors to dissolve identity. So it's a differentiation in this way with a similar signal. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with a few questions, practical application to kind of ground the philosophizing here and leave you with some good questions to ask as we move into this coming year. I'm going to also put a bonus episode that's going to wrap up some things that I kind of left hanging in the ethers and never completed for this year. So the first question that I will leave you with is, who or what in your life reflects something you can't fully embody yet without being identical to you? Okay. Here's one that's a little bit more relationship focused. Where are you seeking sameness when what you actually need is contrast? So this is going to reveal any kind of codependency or twin fantasy or fusion patterns or avoidance. Where are you seeking sameness when what you actually need is contrast? And then what quality do you recognize instantly in others but struggle to stabilize in your own body? And why do you think that is? Another one. Who challenges your coherence not by opposing you, but by holding a different function of the same truth? Who challenges your coherence not by opposing you, but by holding a different function of the same truth? Where do you feel resonance without embodiment? And think about this with a specific topic. Usually money comes into the equation here. I really want to unlock money patterns. I want to unlock behavioral patterns. I want to unlock relationship patterns. I've been in a certain level of work for a while now, and I still can't blank, right? Unlock this area of my life. And final question, The mirror in my life right now is showing me blank, and I've been trying to blank instead of integrate it. The mirror in my life right now is showing me blank, and I've been trying to blank instead of integrate it. I definitely have many of these little nuances going on in my life. Another thing you can ask yourself, just to kind of do a mirror check, because things, people, places, and things will come in to accommodate the patterns that are running in our lives. What do you want to create in your life for this coming cycle? And what is already being shown to you that is accommodating that desire already? What do you want to create? And then what's already being reflected back to you or mirrored back to you that is accommodating that desire? Okay, you guys, thank you so much for this impromptu, for hanging out with me during this podcast episode. I'm going to do a bonus and talk about 3-eye atlas, and then again, close out any loose ends for the year. All right, you guys, I'll see you in this new cycle. Blessings. Take care.